People want to be good in times of sacrifice, and the party is incredibly adept at weaving these narratives where it's about people pulling together and distracting conversation away from the ways that the party itself may have failed. And that was a hugely explosive issue in this case, because there's every indication that the initial cover-up is part of why we saw the virus spread in the first place. In my time looking at China and studying China, I don't think I've ever seen the propaganda system under the kind of strain that it was trying to tamp down discussions of, for example, the death of the young doctor Li Wenliang at the beginning of February, who was held up as a martyr against state efforts to suppress the spread of this information. And you can see now that the propaganda apparatus has tried to co-opt him and has said that he was essentially correct and that the local authorities were the ones who made the mistake. It's the same old song played over again with a few variations, and now it's being played on an international stage too.
What are they even saying?
Matt Schrader, welcome to China Talk.
Hey, good to be here.
So how are you holding up?
Old fashions are great.
I did just order $30 of tea online, which I think is going to cheer me up.
I never really got baicha. Like, I've definitely had it. Is baicha called white tea in English? I don't even know.
I have the transition. So I read something somewhere that apparently the CCP is very upset that tofu is spelled uniformly around the world in the Japanese way, like tofu, T-O-F-U, as opposed to the more like closer to pinyin one. Yeah. So, once they're done talking about coronavirus conspiracy theories, maybe we'll get back to the real meat of where the battle for global hearts and minds is being waged.
That was an amazing transition. This is why you're a professional.
Professional? I don't think I've had an ad on this show in like 4 months. But anyways.
The Lawfare people are getting every penny's worth.
I will say, though, the past few months have seen an uptick in my Patreon subscribers. So I just want to shout out a few of them very briefly. Nicola, Yannick, Robert, Miranda, Stuart, Jan, Albert, Eric, Judith, Joy, and Nick. You guys are all awesome and the best.
And I'm just looking at the list here. There's one down at the Boshilai. That sounds familiar.
He should have enough money to keep me going. If I could pull down more money from this than like the new unemployment insurance for people who never had a job in the first place that Trump just gave me, Bo's really got to step it up there, I think.
Well, and the nice thing is he's not really up to anything else nowadays anyway. Like, he just work on his English, right? Listen to Jordan Snyder, China Econ Talk podcast. Yeah. No, but all the Patreon folks, you folks are the real heroes. Thank you all.
Yes, and to my Substack subscribers, but I didn't ask you guys if you wanted me to say your name, so I will keep your identity secret for now. Overseas Chinese propaganda efforts, something you spend an outrageous amount of your life looking into. Matt, who are you and what do you do?
I work at a place called the German Marshall Fund. There's an initiative there called the Alliance for Securing Democracy where I work. I'm a China analyst. We do work on how authoritarian countries like Russia and China affect the political systems of democracies. So I spend a lot of time thinking about how the CCP tries to get its message out in democracies and how it tries to win support for its policy priorities in democracies around the world.
What are the highs and lows of that experience?
The highs are feeling like you are doing research on and getting into subjects where it can be genuinely groundbreaking, really kind of getting down deep into how the party thinks about the nitty-gritty of politics and influence and getting people to do what it wants. People describe the CCP and the party system as a black box, and it totally is in many ways, but it's also possible to kind of piece together a fairly decent working theory of party politics based on reading historical documents, based on interviewing people, based on talking with wizened elders of the field. And so just getting the sense that when you run across a document or a speech by somebody in like 1936, something that Liu Shaoqi wrote in 1936 when he was helping run all of the underground communist cells in northern China, and you read it and you're like, oh my God, this is describing a philosophy of political practice that's still applicable today. Like, that's a great feeling.
Yeah.
The hardest thing about it is trying to be responsible in applying the lessons of the things you find in documents and the research you do and how you talk about these things publicly. Because what you find when you start doing this work very quickly is that the party has a preference for creating relationships with the establishment in developed countries. And anytime you start talking about the establishment, you need to be very sure about what you're saying. And if you're not responsible about what you're saying, A, you look silly. B, you can get people in trouble. You can hurt people who don't deserve to be hurt. And C, you can get yourself in trouble.
Sure.
And so being able to speak responsibly about these things in a way that doesn't minimize the scope of the problem, describes it accurately, while still working to create consensus around the problem and what to do is probably the hardest part. But I mean, then again, that's politics in a nutshell, really. So It's maybe a good way to sum it up is that it's a very politicized form of analysis. There's no way for it not to be, because you're going right to the heart of money and power and people's interests.
So let's start from the top. What is China trying to do in its overseas propaganda efforts?
So I'm even going to step one step further back, and just say, like, what is Chinese propaganda? Because people tend to go about it in sort of a piecemeal way, and they'll say, like, oh, well, China Daily is China's propaganda, and that's really obvious, and that's really upfront, and it's not that effective. Or they'll say, trying to operationalize diaspora groups through the United Front, that's Chinese propaganda. And in some cases go overboard in talking about how Chinese diaspora is drawn into this. It's sort of a constellation of things, from state media pushing out a message to state and party-linked organs trying to forge individual relationships with institutions and elite and influential individuals overseas to do kind of one-on-one thought work to try to win people over to certain party narratives that they think are useful or influential. It is reaching out to diaspora groups. There's no question that is a part of the strategy. There's a huge part of the party bureaucracy that's devoted to this. It's trying to capture diaspora media. I think the way to sort of sum it up is that the party really wants to have, to the greatest extent it's able, a monopoly on how the subject of China is thought about, talked about, spoken, learned, instructed around the world. And I think you need to think of all of that as propaganda attempts, because that's how the party thinks about it at home, and increasingly how it practices it abroad.
So what is, in fact, the goal of the CCP in managing and presenting what they want to be the image of China abroad?
That one I think we can answer pretty directly. It's to carve out additional space and win consent for the PRC's continued global political rise.
Sure.
And it's everything that hooks into that agenda. So it's making sure that the PRC is able to retain access to high technology and to technological and scientific exchanges. It's trying to project an image as a benign, responsible member of the global order. And any one of another, 10 other things that you and I could list off of. But it's at its core, it's about making sure that China continues to rise more or less unimpeded and hopefully peacefully.
What are the key organizations involved in this effort?
It's a really hard question to answer succinctly, because the real answer is the entire party state is responsible for quote unquote thought work and propaganda work. But the organs that you're going to point to that are most responsible for managing overseas propaganda are things like the propaganda department, which oversees all state media, including all overseas state media. You're going to point to the State and Council Information Office, which helps manage a lot of the day-to-day of overseas messaging. You are going to point at the United Front Work Department, whose job is to ensure to the greatest extent possible, and that caveat's important because the party doesn't always succeed, and in many cases doesn't succeed at all in what it wants to do, but to the greatest extent possible, extend party control and win consent for the party's priorities among the parts of PRC society that aren't the party. So, private companies, universities, overseas diaspora, intellectuals, like these are actual sub-bureaus of the United Front Work Department that are just named like that. The list goes on and on and on and on. It's truly a very large, very complex, and I think largely underappreciated.
Where do you think in this ecosystem you would thrive most professionally?
Oh, that's a great question. That's a great question. You mean if I worked for the Chinese government?
Yeah.
Me in trouble here, Jordan. Where would I thrive? I don't think I'd do very well in the Chinese government because it's so much of professional advancement is about rote repetition of what the people above you say and sort of, pai ma pi, kissing the horse's ass, so to speak, kissing up to the people above you. And I'm just thankful I don't exist in a workplace where my bosses have the personalities where they need those sorts of things, because I don't think I could handle that. I probably would last about a day and a half in the Chinese government.
So Matt, do you want to? Can we assign letter? Well, I know that all American universities now are going away from letter grades for coronavirus time, but I don't think we should let up on our grading of the CCP propaganda organ bureaus. So we're not doing pass fail. We're doing A to F here. Matt, what do you think? What do you think the United Front et al. Deserve for their performance over the past 5-10 years?
Wow, this is a really interesting way of doing this. So I'm going to cop out, and I'm going to give the United Front Work Department an incomplete.
Boo! No,
for the grade. That's a legitimate
God.
grade. I can do that. And I think the reason for that is that we really don't understand very well how the United Front Work Department's work manifests itself in the behavior of, for example, Chinese corporations overseas. I honestly think we really don't know enough to be able to give them a letter grade one way or the other.
Okay.
I think there's still a lot of work left to be done there.
And how about just like, I don't know, CGTN, People's Daily English, Global Times? Do you think they're being the best version of themselves?
Oh man, 10 years ago they would have been F, 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 and F. I think now they're probably up to about a C.
Okay.
They're getting a little bit kind of zippier in their content presentation. Some of it, they're hiring on some polemicists and propagandists who actually have some genuine flair for kind of stirring things up and inserting themselves into the discourse.
Yeah.
They're increasingly adopting some of the tactics you see Russia Today doing that have been a little bit more effective in how they affect certain parts of the Western infosphere. So I think they're probably up to a C at this point collectively.
Okay. So what do you think is keeping these organs from reaching the heights that Russia has been able to achieve over the past few years?
There's a couple things. First, it is that I don't think you can ask the question in isolation just about like CGTN or People's Daily or China Daily. I think you have to ask about the effectiveness of Chinese propaganda as a whole overseas. Because I don't think those organs have been effective as Russia Today, but I think Chinese propaganda as a whole has been pretty effective in instilling in large parts of the global conversation a perception of China as, that its rise is inevitable and unstoppable, that it's essentially peaceful and benevolent, that it is a rising technological and business behemoth. It's not necessarily that any of these things are untrue, but they also just airbrush out all of the unflattering parts of the China story that the party would rather people not know or talk about or be part of the image of China globally.
Yeah.
And so it's, like how many people globally know about the Hukou system and that they're like half the country is permanently dispossessed from healthcare and schooling, and has more or less formed a permanent semi-rural underclass. Like that's not well appreciated globally, and I think to that extent the party's propaganda has been very effective.
Yeah, it's interesting because on the one hand, like it makes what Russia is doing almost more impressive, because I feel like there's like this CGTN is selling a fundamentally like more attractive product than Putin's Russia, which like doesn't really have a lot going for it. But it almost seems like when I watch CGTN, like there is so much focus on you, as on you said, Matt, of like putting China in this positive light and like showing all these like happy people and whatnot, as opposed to Russia Today, which is like just pretty content to stir up shit.
Yeah, right. You were pointing out the thing about telling a positive story. Something that's really interesting that I think that points to is how China's external propaganda really resembles the internal propaganda, and that those themes have like really come out strongly during the coronavirus thing, where people joke about it in China that the evening news, the first 10 minutes is look how busy our nation's leaders are. Second 10 minutes is look how happy our nation's citizens are. Last 10 minutes are look at how crazy the rest of the world is.
Yeah.
And that's literally been the message in a nutshell of PRC state media externally. The organs that are directed at Italy or Spain or any other foreigners, that's basically been what their message has been during the coronavirus. It's been, look at how hard we're working for you. Look at how good a job we've done tamping down the infections inside of China. And look at how crazy everything else is all over the world. We've
recorded 20 minutes. We probably have like 14. Okay. Anyways, whatever. It's not.
No, I haven't read this, but wait. Let me guess. The assessments is like it, may be a little bit more effective, but it will be limited by its state association.
So Matt, I hear you have a bit of personal experience in this world.
Yeah, no, I worked at the Global Times for, I forget if it's 7, 8, 9 months. I forget the exact number, but worked there for a bit when the company I worked at prior to coming back to the States, Smart Air, when we were trying to get Smart Air up and running, and I needed a little bit of outside income. So I doubled up working for the Global Times for a bit.
What stuck out to you about the experience?
Well, I left after I edited a story about how a Uyghur academic named Ilham Tohti was an enemy of the state and deserved what he was getting when he was being sentenced to prison. The real story on this guy is that he was like a moderate academic who taught at Capital Minorities University and basically was just like, can we not be so like racist and overblown in our policy towards Uyghurs? And he got thrown in jail for that, and he's still in jail now. But just having to edit a story about him, I almost felt sick at my desk and was just like, even if I'm doing this to help do another job where I'm doing something good, I just can't justify it on that basis anymore. So that was a day where I'm like, okay, I gotta find a way to go full time at Smart Air.
So aside from the sort of narrative that like the West is broken and China, we have everything under control, there's also been a fascinating dynamic of a fair number of Chinese government Twitter personalities seeding or pushing rumors that the U.S. was in fact behind the seeding and spread of the virus. So what exactly is going on here?
Whew. Well, that's the $64 million question: is are we seeing a permanent shift in how the PRC does information operations? Because the conventional wisdom on them up until very recently was that they don't do that kind of stuff like Russia does, where they are just spreading outright misinformation, apparently in an attempt to muddy the information environment. And they're doing it now. And the question is are they going to keep doing it? Now, the PRC ambassador to the U.S., Cui Tiankai, gave an interview last week to Axios where he more or less just disowned all of this disinformation around the origin of the virus, and he said that it's a waste of time and diplomats shouldn't be doing it. And there was a lot of speculation in the China Watcher community about Is this a brushback of the people spreading these conspiracies? Is it an attempt to extend the hand to the U.S. and try to reduce tensions? The problem is that we've seen other state organs continue to put out misinformation since then. It's hard to say right now whether this is going to be permanent. I think to some extent that's going to be contingent upon how effective it appears to be. And at the moment, it seems like the attempts to spread these rumors directly through state organs, through foreign ministry spokespeople, provoked such a reaction that they've decided maybe it's better to pull back and reevaluate. But I really doubt this is the last we're going to see of the PRC trying to do misinformation. I mean, when I talk about reading historical documents, looking at how the CCP operated during the war against Japan and the KMT, you start to realize that they've got deep roots in these sorts of dirty tricks.
Yeah.
That that's been part of the party's operating system for a long time. And so, even if we haven't seen them do this kind of stuff up until now, I don't think there's any reason to think that they are not capable of it or wouldn't do it if they thought that it would work.
I mean, Mao incited revolution across the world, even more aggressively than the Soviet Union did for a handful of decades. So this is certainly not something that isn't baked deep into the CCP's the CCP's operating structure. Though it is interesting.
Well,
seeing...
that's kind of I mean the exporting revolution thing like that. Xi Jinping, before he came to power in 2011, he gave a speech to a bunch of expatriate Chinese businessmen in Mexico, basically complaining about how people complained about China, saying and one of the complaints was, well, we don't export revolution anymore. So what are you complaining about?
Yeah.
I don't know about the exporting revolution thing, but seeking to turn people against one another, seed disinformation, muddy the information environment. I don't think there's any reason to think that they've forgotten all of those tricks.
Yeah, it was interesting. Someone mentioned on Twitter the fact that there may be not only an ideological but also a generational split, and these are the sort of young guns are the ones who are speaking up on Twitter and whatnot. And there's an older generation, the Cui Tiankais of the world, who are not quite as comfortable with using this playbook. But as those folks age out of the system, you may have a bit of a generational shift.
Yeah, and I think Cui was also representative of kind of a different era in PRC strategy towards the United States, where sort of the primary external propaganda goal vis-a-vis the U.S. was simply just to mollify us, to sort of keep us from getting too alarmed at the PRC's accumulation of, both hard and soft power. And, as a result, his sensibilities, I think, are much more attuned towards kind of talking us down and reassuring us and trying to emphasize that the PRC is there for cooperation. Whereas, folks like Zhao Lijian, as you very rightly pointed out, they've come up in a really different world. They've come to professional maturity in a world where China's ability to continue accumulating power isn't necessarily contingent on the whims of Washington.
Yeah. Is there an analogy for the Stephen Millers of the world?
What, inside of the PRC government?
Well, no, I mean just in that like a generation gap, raised on Fox News, more comfortable of just not speaking the truth.
Oh, it's an interesting analogy. I hadn't thought of it that way.
So Matt, how does the propaganda push around coronavirus compare to past ways that the CCP has tried to manage natural disasters?
Oh yeah, that's a good question. I mean, the one that comes most immediately to mind is the Wenzhou earthquake, the Sichuan earthquake in 2008. There's not really been anything that's had this international dimension. But that's about the closest parallel that I can think of. I mean, I remember actually I was in Beijing when that happened. I was on the 10th story of a building in the financial district. And I was in the bathroom when it happened. Ooh. And I remember the doors in the bathroom started to swing. And I was standing up and I started to feel a little dizzy. And I didn't realize why I was dizzy until I was oh, this is an earthquake. And I had no idea what was happening other than there was an earthquake until I got back to my desk and my coworkers were like, there's been this huge earthquake out in Sichuan. And, you know, in the weeks and the months after that, you saw a bunch of these really traditional narratives mobilized where it's really about like playing up the stories of individual heroes and individual sacrifices and making the sacrifice of the people and the collective struggle of the state and the party all seem like one in people's minds. It's about building that sense of shared unity. But I mean, in a time of disaster, like you're pushing on an open door with those kinds of things typically in most cases, because people want to feel brought together. They want to feel bound together. I mean, I remember a year after that, on the date, you know, the exact date of the earthquake, I was still working at the same place, and we all took off work. We all came down to the bottom of the building. Everybody in the big office building, everybody stood outside in front of the building, and we all stood there for, I can't remember how many minutes it was now, 4 or 5 minutes of silence, the duration of the earthquake, while air raid sirens went off. And everybody in every building all up and down Financial Street was doing this all together. And I mean, a sense of shared sacrifice is an immensely powerful tool. And it's not entirely based on a lie. Like, people want to help each other out. People want to be good in times of sacrifice. And the party is incredibly adept at weaving these narratives where it's about people pulling together and distracting conversation away from the ways that, you know, the ways the party itself may have failed. And that was a hugely explosive issue in this case, because there's every indication that the initial cover-up is part of why we saw the virus spread in the first place. In my time looking at China and studying China, I don't think I've ever seen the propaganda system under the kind of strain that it was trying to tamp down discussions of, for example, the death of the young doctor Li Wenliang at the beginning of February, who was held up as a martyr against state efforts to suppress the spread of this information. And you can see now that the propaganda apparatus has tried to co-opt him and has said that he was essentially correct and that the local authorities were the ones who made the mistake. So it's the same old song played over again with, you know, a few variations, and now it's being played on an international stage too.
Sure. You know, it's funny because, like, recently I've been watching a lot of American local television news coverage, and, you know, there are parts of it that are the same and there are parts of it that are very different, right? You know, you have these, like, inspiring stories of the nurses that are, you know, doing their best, but you also have, like, really aggressive takedowns of Bill de Blasio and, you know, really hard questions coming at the governor of, you know, where the ventilators are and why they aren't here yet. And you see politicians like going at each other, saying, you know, from Trump to the governors and whatnot. And you know, there was like a moment, there were like 2.5 weeks where I think the censors were still on lockdown and on vacation, and they hadn't gotten their, you know, Ding Talk accounts set up. And I think there was just the system was so thrown off balance by what was happening that, you know, you did see Chinese journalists really, really digging. And it's sad to watch that window really have closed to a pretty dramatic extent over
and I mean, Caixin in particular, I think, really needs to be singled out on this. I mean, they continue to do it. They're continuing to report on, you know, are there efforts to suppress the real death toll? And the reporters from Caixin, you know, I think a lot of the Western reporters on the ground there in Wuhan, like, as long as you and I are here talking on something that other people are going to hear, I think we got to call out, like how unbelievably brave it is to be on the ground in the middle of a city that's been completely locked down, while, you know, everything around you is chaos, and still trying to do the job of uncover stories people don't want you to know, or to share a story that doesn't want to be shared. Huge debt of gratitude to those people, at least from my part.
So, Matt, you've written a bit about how Huawei echoes amplified and gets amplified by CCP propaganda. You want to talk a little bit about how that worked between these, between the government and, you know, nominally private entities?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, and I don't think it's one that has gotten enough study yet. So if you look at the themes that Huawei puts out in its propaganda, they largely accord with a lot of the same messages that PRC state propaganda puts out. The one that you see the most is the theme of cooperation, that Huawei is here to cooperate. Huawei is here to provide countries with public goods. Huawei is here to make your life better. Now, I mean, that's pretty normal for a company, but I think to some extent that kind of speaks to the sophistication of the external messaging that the party state itself does. That they're mostly about putting out kind of bland, benign themes of cooperation that people can attach their own meanings to, or are very kind of vague and high level and easy to remake into particular situations. Really good example of that was around the last European Parliament elections in the summer of last year, where you actually had Huawei placing ads across the continent saying, vote for European values, vote for Huawei. The implication being like they're trying to identify Huawei with European values like connectivity and openness, which is just completely not in line with how the company itself actually operates. It's a private company. It's not clear who owns it. It's not clear always who its ultimate beneficial owners are. It's not clear to the extent to which the party is embedded in the company, although we know that several of the senior managers are party members. So it's an attempt to kind of put out benign messages of cooperation that sort of airbrush or elide important areas of reality. And, Huawei does this, I think, probably better than almost any other PRC private company. But it's you see a lot of other PRC corporates trying to do the same thing as well.
What role do you think Twitter, Facebook, YouTube should play in engaging with this overseas propaganda? Do you think the CCP has a right to speak, particularly since, of course, they don't grant Western media and governments the same rights that Western countries give Chinese firms and government entities domestically?
I mean, this is a really hard question, and I go back and forth on it myself, too. I think ultimately I've come down to the place where really we shouldn't be allowing PRC propaganda organs or even diplomats to put their message out on Twitter when they aggressively deny our own countries the same privilege of doing so on platforms like Weibo or WeChat, because they're using them as platforms to present the same airbrushed version of reality that they present domestically, and now increasingly using it for outright disinformation. And we actually track internally at ASD, where I work, the number of official Twitter accounts that the PRC has, and that number has climbed precipitously in the past year. We're now up to tracking somewhere around 190 accounts internally, and that's up from maybe 50 in April or May of last year. So there's a really aggressive push on to Twitter going on. The party state clearly has identified it as an area where it can get a lot of value out of getting its message out. I don't think they should have that platform. Frankly, it's just not fair. But I know that's just my personal opinion. That's not an institutional opinion. There's disagreement even where I work about this sort of thing. And there's really good reasons to argue the other side, that we value freedom of speech, that we value public discourse and public debate. We value the marketplace of ideas. But ultimately I come down on the side of not permitting them this platform, A, because of the reciprocity, and because fundamentally the party state is engaging with these platforms in bad faith. It is a nation state that isn't interested in the marketplace of ideas. It's not interested in allowing or promoting debate. At a systemic level, this is not how the PRC works, even though obviously there's vast diversity of opinion among people who live inside the PRC. And so permitting that system the privilege of engaging on our systems that are based on a different set of values, which they then use to undermine, I don't think it's good policy or good strategy.
The coronavirus propaganda push on the part of the CCP really seems to have been changing the debate. I've seen a handful of senators writing letters saying that these folks have been deplatformed. So it seems like the status quo may be changing with regards to these sorts of issues.
Yeah, yeah, no, I agree.
So what about TikTok and WeChat? I think, with everyone staying at home, TikTok use is going up. A lot of people who don't listen to this podcast don't necessarily understand just how big a role WeChat plays in, ethnic Chinese life across the world. So what is happening on these platforms, which may or may not be concerning, and what do you think governments around, democracies around the world should be considering when thinking about these platforms?
Well, I mean, I think there's a different set of concerns around those two platforms because they speak to very different communities inside of democratic countries. I mean, with WeChat, you're talking about mostly folks in the Chinese diaspora, but those folks are, they're existing within kind of a walled garden of information where the party gets to kind of pick and choose and curate which narratives make it onto their screens. Obviously there's limits to the party's control. I think people tend to kind of blow out of proportion the panopticon aspect of the party state sometimes. I mean, when you actually live in China, it can be sort of weird, the disconnect between how loose the control feels and stories about tight control in Western media. But the reality of how it actually functions is that narratives the party really doesn't want appearing on these things don't appear. And that can really skew the information that folks inside of democracies who rely on this receive. And the censorship there is very aggressive. TikTok is different in that it's directed at everybody in the United States. Anybody with a cell phone can be on TikTok. You don't have to speak Chinese to use the platform. The concern.
My little brother
TikTok,
just
though,
wanted to make a TikTok with me this morning.
Well, I mean, if you guys are both decently good looking, there's a good chance that TikTok's algorithms will make sure that you get out there.
What I think is really interesting about, or one of the many things I find fascinating about TikTok, is it seems that there, this isn't necessarily like a CCP propaganda thing, but there are different values. I think whether it's from living in a one-party state, whether it's just from China versus the West, that seem to be embedded in what is in some of the moderation guidelines that have leaked out about how TikTok is regulating its own platform.
Yeah, no, that's a good point, and I don't know if I necessarily disagree or necessarily agree with the assertion that there's no like direct party state propaganda stuff going on, but that's sort of a separate thing. The thing you're talking about is algorithms that automatically promote people who are good looking and don't promote people who are, the algorithm determines are not good looking, who it determines are overweight, because the algorithm has decided that's what's going to get more eyeballs. And like that's very much around like norms within the tech space in China. Compared with norms in the tech space here in the U.S. I think in China in the tech space there's much less hesitation like to do literally anything and everything to optimize your product to the greatest extent possible, and there's less asking like, how is this going to affect people or how might this marginalize people? I will say
though that like 95% of the YouTube videos that show up on my feed have above average looking people on it. So I think
you
there's
say
like
YouTube. You meant TikTok or YouTube?
Oh, on YouTube. So
so you're saying it's kind of the same thing, right?
Well, I feel like yes, I'm not 100% sold on it. I don't think any Western company would have a document saying we're not pushing old and disabled people's videos. However, I think that like there's just something about like the nature of virality, and a lot of Western social media platforms have bought into it, which is this is what drives growth. And the videos that happen to drive growth are sort of the same all around the world. So it may be nudging in one way or the other, but like I think there's like something just intrinsic to the essence of growth, consumer-facing social media companies that want to get really big really fast and surface the most viral content.
There's totally I'm obviously not an expert on social media algorithms, but there's obviously a social bias towards people who are better looking that probably accounts for a lot of what you're seeing with YouTube. But I honestly would really doubt if YouTube had like purposely optimized its algorithm to promote better looking people over those that the algorithm considers not. And I think that's kind of the big difference there, that it's baked into the tech on the TikTok side. I don't think you can get away from the party control thing in the case of TikTok either, because they are inextricably a company based in the PRC, and they were called to the mat about a year and a half ago for how their platforms inside China weren't sufficiently in line with what the party wanted to be seeing. That they were allowing inappropriate jokes about party leaders. They were allowing inappropriate conversation about the party and about politics to circulate on their platforms. And they got called to the mat. One of their most popular apps got just taken down. People couldn't use it anymore. Some of their other popular apps got suspended for a brief period. And the guy, Zhang Xiaoming, the guy who runs ByteDance, TikTok's parent company, ended up releasing this really almost groveling letter at like 3 or 4 in the morning, where filled with CCP buzzwords. He's promising to do a better job instilling the 4 consciousnesses, which if I explain would probably put your audience to sleep. But it's to use an American analogy, it's basically like if a corporate CEO here filled his letter with "We're going to make America great again" over and over and over again.
Yeah. And included like the typos too.
Yeah. But it's basically a sign of ByteDance is really working hard in its PR efforts to try to spin itself as we're an international company, and we're going to separate the moderation in the United States from the moderation in China, and we're going to work hard to educate people about our moderation practices here in the U.S. But the ultimate reality of it is the company's based in China. Its senior officers are all Chinese, and they ultimately answer to the party. And that makes them a potential vector for party influence.
Let's talk about tech and racial profiling, particularly in the U.S. So you wrote a piece recently with Peter Mattis talking about the right and wrong way to look at the espionage threat from China. What's the way to, as you write, thread the needle and counter China's determined norm-busting technology drive without creating a new wave of racial stigma?
Well, I think this is actually a larger question about, it's not just the technology drive. It's really the larger question of how do we counter PRC influence or interference or whatever you want to call it in general. The thing that's really, really hard to do is make clear that there's an aggressive, revanchist power, the CCP, that wants to rewrite the rules of the global order and wants to put itself at the center of it, and is aggressively, actively accumulating power towards this end, and is fundamentally hostile to democratic norms that most democracies think are important. Now you got that on the one hand, and trying to drive home to people the urgency of trying to inoculate some of our political systems against the effects of this rise. But on the other hand, also making clear to people that in the vast majority of cases, that has nothing to do with regular Chinese people and their societies, or people in the Chinese diaspora and their societies. That you're talking about people who, just want better lives for their kids and for their families. And I think that where Peter and I came down on that, ultimately, the way you thread that needle is your burden of proof for saying, oh, somebody's working with the CCP. Somebody's an agent in the CCP, or they're infiltrating someplace. The burden of proof for using language like that, it has to be incredibly high. You have to have really good, solid proof. You can't insinuate, because doing that kind of thing publicly gives permission for people who may not understand the party system very well to be really irresponsible in how they throw those sorts of epithets around. And that can hurt people, and that can destroy lives. And it sets a bad example for folks who do enforcement and who do things related to the enforcement centers of the U.S. government, who aren't necessarily China experts. It can point them in the wrong direction. and get their heads in the wrong place. And so I think people who work on these issues need to be really measured and really responsible in how they characterize influence. And I think by and large a big component of that is directing the lens of your analysis away from regular Chinese people and towards the interactions of people with, frankly, with money and power, towards their interactions with the party state system, towards people who have a lot to gain from those interactions, who have business interests they're trying to promote or clients they're trying to cultivate. And once you start looking at it through that lens, like that's a lens that has really nothing to do with ethnicity. Do
you have an Elon Musk riff? Elon
seems like he mostly has his heart in the right place. I mean, they're clearly going out of their way in Shanghai to make him feel as welcome as possible, so that he will then tell the rest of the world how wonderful it is to do business there.
I don't know, man. I think they took him to like a Haidilao.
Oh, it wouldn't surprise me. I mean, Haidilao's amazing. I mean, that's the kind of place that you go there and like you come back being like, oh man, they really got their stuff together in China. Like, why can't we do this here in the States? But then you realize that like they have access to a pool of labor that they pay them all $2 an hour.
The one time I had expensive hot pot was this like Cantonese like chicken fish broth, and it was yellow and it was awful. And
I know the one you're talking about. Yeah, dude, like high-end Chinese cuisine is it was just never for me. I always loved just the the jiaqiang cai, like regular restaurant stuff.
I haven't bought Chinese ingredients yet. I'm embracing the sourdough trend. My starter is on day 5. I made like waffles with it this morning.
I need to get a waffle maker. That's an amazing idea.
So Matt, let's wrap up with something happy. You worked at Smart Air, which I think is one of the most, one of the foreign created companies in China, which I think has like changed my life the most, and allowed me to run my 9-minute mile yesterday. So what were some interesting challenges you guys had in growing and scaling up the business?
Yeah.
Well, first explain what it is.
Smart Air is it's a social enterprise that was started by a pretty amazing guy named Thomas Talhelm, who has started, grown, run this business at the same time that he leads this entire other life as like a groundbreaking social psychologist doing amazing research on social differences in different parts of China. He's a professor at the Booth School now at University of Chicago, and I like all the credit for this goes to him. I came in after the company was started. I was there for about a year and a half. The growth of the company, its success is all down to Thomas and the team he's assembled around him. But it was great to get to be there for a little bit. So Smart Air, basically the main thing is making do-it-yourself air purifiers, which sounds insane. But once you realize like that an air purifier at its core is literally just like a fan that forces air through a filter, and that's really like all even the highest end air purifiers are, then you really can like make your own air purifier just by strapping a HEPA filter to a fan. And so like that's what Thomas did, and he tested it, and it was like, man, this really works. Like it's gotten rid of almost all the pollution in my room. And he ended up making it a business and just sourcing literal like tabletop fans from a supplier in China, and finding a decent HEPA filter sourcer, which is more difficult than you would expect. And there's tons of stories even behind that one little thing. But just sourcing those two things, and you strap them together and you turn them on.
Let's get a HEPA filter supplier story.
Oh, dude. I mean, so the thing that was really crazy, it was sort of like, we're not in Kansas anymore for me, was like seeing how, so like Smart Air was like never that big a company. Like I think, the turnover the last month I was there was like very low 6 figures US. And that was like at a peak of like smog inside of Beijing, when sales just go crazy. But getting on like Taobao, Alibaba's sort of Amazon shop, getting on there and seeing how even for this like really tiny company that hadn't generated that much media interest, like how many people were trying to sell like fake Smart Air stuff on Taobao
Jesus.
was amazing. Like there were page after page after page of people selling filters where they basically, like, you know, the graphic of the filter was like the text in it said, Smart Air is trying to cheat you. They're making profits hand over fist. Buy our filter instead. And like we actually bought some of these because they were selling for a third of what we were selling our filter for. I think we sold our filters for I can't even remember anymore. I think it was like $10 a pop, almost at cost.
Yeah.
But we'd buy these and just test them to see, like, well, maybe somebody else has found some cheaper filters that work better than ours, and maybe we'll just use those instead. And they were always crap.
Yeah.
Like, they were always just really, really bad. And so it was people basically like either pretending to be us and selling crap that didn't work, or, you know, trying to undercut us by saying that we were a bunch of lying, cheating thieves and then selling crap that didn't work. But I mean, it was crazy. We were always selling basically cost plus, like, very low labor costs that we were paying ourselves. Because I mean, it's social enterprise, right? Like, the whole point is you're actually trying to do something good in the world with a commercial mechanism. So, I mean, Thomas, those guys, they're amazing. It was a real privilege to be involved with them for a little bit.
And lastly, any Chinese literature recommendations, either in translation or in the Mandarin, for those daring enough?
I mean, you honestly, you can't go wrong with Mo Yan. Red Sorghum is his classic novel, and it was made into, you know, Zhang Yimou's classic film with Gong Li later on. But like, the novel's really, really good. You know, it's almost I didn't know a lot about it going in because I didn't bother to read up on it. I just wanted to sort of have the pure experience. And it's got these really wonderful, like, magical realism elements and time shifting and unreliable narrators. Like, Mo Yan's really busting out all the tricks in this kind of bawdy, action-filled, vivid story. So it's, once you read something like that, you're like, oh yeah, like, there's a reason they gave this guy a Nobel Prize. He's really good at what he does.
And maybe finally, your coronavirus game of choice, Matt. For the record, China Talk has its own Discord channel now. I will be putting a link in the show notes for all those stuck at home looking to bond. I think we might be starting a Warhammer Online guild.
Oh boy, I don't think I need another chat room to waste my time. I mean, the game of choice is Overwatch. You know, I actually don't even really play anything else. I just, at the end of the day, I want something that's just like completely mindless, and it's like, oh, I'm going to get on here and I'm just going to shoot some people in the face, or I'm going to freeze them as Mei and just really annoy the other team.
I feel like Mei could be a Chinese spy. That's kind of vibe I get. I guess she's supposed to be Japanese.
Come on, we're not here to cast aspersions, man. Like, Mei's a scientist.
All the more,
dude. No. I just did that whole big thing about how we have to be responsible. Like, you can't. No.
Matt, thanks so much for coming on China Talk.
Dude, it was a pleasure. Thank you for having me on.